The Adventures of Crocduck is a single-stage Onslaught 2D platformer. In this game, the player is charged with defeating seemingly endless waves of enemies. As the player defeats more and more waves, new types of enemies are introduced and current enemies get tougher. In this video, I'm going to discuss many of the game design features in the Adventures of Crocduck. This was the first game I developed and for me served two purposes: to show myself I could make a video game from start to finish, and two, to experiment with flow, the concept of balancing the player's mastery of game mechanics with the difficulty set forth by the game. If done correctly, the player loses track of time and is completely immersed in the experience. So how did I achieve flow in the Adventures of Crocduck? My first job was to create a set of controls and abilities for the game. Long story short, I created a half crocodile, half duck that spits bees from his mouth. The inherent silliness of the game would do well to initially hook players with its novelty. The controls themselves are pretty simple: run, jump, spit bees. Now that we have our controls, the next step is to stress test the player's mastery of these controls. In the Adventures of Crocduck, there are both systematic and random mechanisms in place to stress the player's mastery. These systems also have a secondary function to help ease players into the learning curve of the game and to avoid stagnancy and boredom. One of the systematic mechanisms in the Adventures of Crocduck is the way in which enemies are incorporated into play. When the game starts, the player will always fight the flyers first. The next enemy to be introduced is the launcher. After that, the crab. While each enemy possesses unique abilities which make the game harder, the timing of their incorporation is purposeful as it helps players learn important skills that will be necessary for future success. The flyer, the first enemy you fight, exists to teach the player the most basic skill, spitting bees. If you can spit bees, you can defeat these enemies. The second enemy, the launcher, spits fireballs at the player. Now spitting bees isn't the only answer. The player must learn to dodge fireballs or take damage. The third enemy, the floater, drops smoke from the top of the screen which inhibits Crocduck's movement and destroys Crocduck's bees. This forces the player to learn map awareness. Each additional enemy was created keeping in mind this ideal. An example of a random mechanism in the Adventures of Crocduck that helps to foster flow is the bees that Crocduck spits. Crocduck is capable of spitting two types of bees: yellow defensive bees and red offensive bees. The yellow bees are programmed to perform a random walk. Basically, they move around the screen up, down, left, right completely randomly. The red bees will always move in the direction they are fired. However, their vertical movement succumbs to a random walk. Other than simply behaving like bees, this mechanic is designed to keep the player always on their toes and adapting. While most of the time the bees do the job of defeating enemies, the player must be aware of when the bees do not make contact with an enemy and formulate a plan in the heat of the moment to avoid taking damage. Another random mechanism that exists is the way in which the enemies themselves get tougher. After each wave, out of all the enemies that are currently spawning, one has its abilities upgraded. This selection is done completely randomly. This makes sure the player is continuously met with new challenges as they progress through the game, and also helps encourage replay, since each playthrough will be different. Maybe during one playthrough the launchers, enemies that spit fireballs at you, hit maximum level before any of the other enemies. This will force the player's strategy to adapt to countering the launchers first and foremost. Maybe the floater, the enemy that drops smoke which destroys Crocduck's bees and inhibits Crocduck's movement, upgrades quicker than the rest. The player should be on the lookout for smoke more so than usual and keep it in mind to choose a place to fight before unleashing bees. The last major random mechanism in place is the surge, a random but temporary upgrade of an enemy that occurs in the heat of battle. Each enemy has a specific surge or set of surges associated with them. The flyers can turn into fireballs, dramatically increasing their speed, or adorn masks which increase their health. The launchers have a surge which causes them to explode upon death, dealing damage to Crocduck if he's in the blast radius. The surge exists to add a new dimension of difficulty to any given wave. The concept of the surge is similar to runners training for marathons. To improve their times, runners will disperse quick sprints within their long-distance runs. By temporarily stressing their performance, they increase their speed and endurance upon reverting back to their normal pace. When faced with the game's many trials and tribulations, the player has a tool they can use to adapt to the systematic and random hurdles set forth by the game, upgrading Crocduck's abilities. The player can choose to upgrade damage, rate of fire, health, speed, and can unlock the ability to double jump. the player can use these upgrades as a tool to augment their deficiencies in order to complete the game. If a player is having trouble with the floaters, upgrading Crocduck's speed or unlocking the ability to double jump will increase their ability to maneuver around the smoke. Are enemies taking too long to die? Upgrade damage. Are there too many enemies on screen? Upgrade rate of fire. The upgrade system in Crocduck is best employed as a reactionary tool. To quickly touch on some other mechanics that help to foster flow, we have an equation which dictates how many enemies must be defeated in order to complete the given wave. If a new enemy begins to spawn, more enemies will need to be defeated in order to complete the new wave. If flyers or launchers upgrade levels, more enemies will need to be defeated since their spawn rates are increasing. Basically, this algorithm exists to make sure each wave lasts a proper amount of time by taking into account the randomness of enemy upgrades and the systematic incorporation of new enemies into play. Well, I hope you enjoyed this game design video on the Adventures of Crocduck. This game was a pleasure to make, and I hope you enjoy all the hard work I, the artists, composers, voice actors, and game testers put into this project. And remember, if you ever need a laugh, just think to yourself that there's a game out there where you play as a half crocodile, half duck who spits bees from his mouth, who battles an evil sentient bird. I'll let that sink in.